Welcome everyone to week 1 of your first topic, lead communication. And in week 1, we are covering the first chapter of your topic, which is all about communication protocols. You will be learning how to establish and create a communication protocol. If this concept is new to you, you may be wondering, why would you want a communication protocol? So let's jump in and find out. Well thought through communication is vital to all your exchanges, and perhaps you found out about that the hard way, or maybe communication has gone very well for you in the past. When we're engaging in spontaneous communication as opposed to planned communication, it can be easy to overlook how well communication or not determines the outcome, which we then experience the effects of. So that includes how well you and your client can meet established goals. The power of having well thought through and designed protocols is that they support positive communication outcomes. Establishing rules around how communication is conducted or implemented can benefit every kind of relationship, so that goals of all parties can be met. Examples of just benefits you can expect include that protocols help protect relationships in the process of achieving goals. They facilitate goodwill and respect simply by what you're building into the design, and the goals of all parties in an exchange can be met. So all of that partially occurs because of the planning that goes in. The definition of a communication protocol, or we actually have a couple of definitions. So the first is a framework of rules designed to ensure correct processes in the transmission of information. So that is fundamental to workplace communication. Communication protocols will include the formal systems and processes within the organisation which are used in communication. They are essential for managing an effective communication process. So this should go without saying that professional relationships require communication to follow conduct which is culturally and socially accepted. So cultural and background and diversity is something to be mindful of when creating a communication protocol. Now, a simple example of a communication protocol could be with you as a coach and you and your clients, and you want to support empowering behaviour with a pre-prepared set of communication guidelines. And you share those guidelines with your clients in the early stages of commencing work with them so that you've got an agreed starting point. An example of such a guideline could be asking your clients to avoid the use of phrases such as "I can't," which limits the opportunity for change and therefore the potential effectiveness of the coaching sessions. So that is all going to affect how well you and your client are able to meet your goals. Another definition is that communication protocols describe how data is exchanged between parties depending on the goal and information needs. So, for example, email templates, website copyright and content, meeting templates, etc. All of these methods need to be planned. So the planning stages are outlined in 4 steps, which are analysing for information needs relevant to your workplace goals, developing communication protocols according to identified needs and goals, identifying contexts to adapt your protocols to, and then preparing the materials which support the implementation of your communication protocol. So there's actually lots of opportunity to get creative here for your own business and or when you as a team leader or budding team leader or manager, whichever the case may be, there's lots of scope here to be creative and create a communication process that you're going to enjoy seeing implemented and implementing yourself with your clients. They're also going to protect your role, your relationships, which we sort of talked about before, and the organization, whether that's your own business or an organization you're working for. Now, the first of the planning steps is analyze internal and external information needs relevant to the workplace. Now, that's going to involve reviewing the goals and objectives your communication protocols are designed to meet. You're going to first need a communication protocol or process that addresses internal communication needs, such as meeting minutes, evacuation procedures, whatever the case may be. And then potentially this would be followed by a process addressing external communication needs, such as communication with clients, emails, or website and social media content. While designing your message, make sure it aligns with company culture, upholds the reputation, and follows established and overarching policies and procedures. Other things to consider are your audience, the communication need and goal, how you're communicating. Is it going to be written communication, oral communication, and the frequency of the communication. To establish communication protocols sufficiently, you need to analyze information needs relevant to your workplace, which we have already discussed. So another aspect to this is, what are information needs? Simply, they are the recorded material or data that a person requires from a given information source. You're going to need an understanding of the different definitions that come up in this first chapter in order to complete your workbook activity. And that workbook activity or activities is going to be around designing a communication protocol and then implementing it. So you can, again, that is going to be an opportunity for you to create something that will apply to your own business. And I really strongly encourage you to do that. Organisational information needs may be required internally by managers or staff, or externally by stakeholders. Information needs are fulfilled through different forms of communication or mediums. And some examples of those that could be used for internal communication needs are induction training, the intranet, memorandums and reports. Or examples of those platforms or mediums that you would use for external communication needs could be business meetings, emails, newsletters, social media, etc. Okay, so then we move along from analysing to the actual development of your communication protocols. Always the overall purpose of a communication protocol is the fulfillment of an organisational goal and needs, which means your protocol is fulfilling internal or external information needs. There are 7 elements which your communication protocol which is going to help build your communication protocol. We're going to go over each of those 7 elements, And these, of course, are covered in your learner resource as well, which I encourage you to go and have a little bit more read of, because these webinars are really just giving you an overview of the information to make it simple to understand. But any aspect of this that you need more in-depth understanding of, and you will need more in-depth understanding in order to create a communication protocol, then of course you need to go and refer to your learning materials. Now, the first of the 7 elements is scope. The scope refers to who the protocol will be used by. Now, don't confuse that with your audience, because your scope could be used by a team, a department, or your entire organization, but your audience could be external. Then again, scope can also be external, depending on who is requiring the information that your communication protocol is delivering. So external scope could be your supply chain, all of your supply chain. It could be shareholders or stockholders. It could be the public. You'll find all of this described, both your internal scope and external scope, on pages 20 and 21 of your learner resource. The next elements of your communication protocol will be your information need and who is responsible for delivering that information or executing the information. So again, the information need is the data that is required, that forms the basis or the structure of your communication, and it guides the reason for your communication protocol. Now, if you're allocating responsibilities of who is to implement or overseeing the implementation of a communication protocol, there's some steps that you will want to go through with the allocation as well. So first of all, you want to make sure that you've got your expected standard of communication well defined. You're going to want to determine the level of responsibility and identify suitable workers to take on that responsibility. You will then assign and explain the responsibility. You'll then enact the responsibility, and finally monitor and review the allocation. So, for example, with all of those steps, if you're allocating daily project progress reporting, tasks could include checking and collating reports, replying to and escalating concerns, and that could require 2 people to complete, such as 2 assistant managers. First of all, you'll want to explain the responsibility in detail to those managers, clarifying their concerns and questions. You'll inform then the team of the process to be followed and the role of the 2 assistant managers that have been selected. And then you will select members of the team to enact their responsibilities. And finally, members of the team can anonymously provide feedback, perhaps a week after the allocation and process has been implemented, so that improvements can be made. Allocation is, and the steps involved, is not something that you're going to need to go into in your activities. You're really going to be just designing communication protocol and then implementing it yourself with a team member or somebody who can role play that team member. It is important, though, to understand the extent of all of these 7 key elements that form a communication protocol. You also have the medium of communication, which we've looked at previously for internal and external communication needs, whether that's email, intranet messaging, on-site meetings, print, social media, video conferencing, etc. And your audience. While your communication protocols are about actioning your organizational goals, communication itself is always about people, and that includes your audience. So the needs of your audience are important to consider for the effectiveness of your protocols. Your workbook involves designing a communication protocol, which I've already mentioned, with each of these 7 key elements. And you may need a little bit of help differentiating scope from audience. So when designing an internal communication protocol and you're needing to work out who is my scope, who is my audience, you can ask yourself in terms of internal scope, which departments would use this? Whereas your audience may be external, for example, customers, or if it's internal staff or internal audience, it may be a sector of staff, such as staff that needs training. So again, for internal communication protocols and which has an internal scope, who within the organization is going to use this? Is it going to be the managers implementing the protocol? Is it going to be a team member implementing the protocol? So think implement. When you're designing a communication protocol for external use, in other words, the scope is going to be external, and you want to differentiate that scope from your audience, you're going to ask, who are the stakeholders that require this information, that need to use it? And that might be, for example, an external training organization that is going to come in and train your staff. So the audience, in fact, could be internal and being your staff being trained, and the scope could be external. When sometimes the scope and audience can be the same when the entity requiring the protocol for use is the same as the entity the information is being delivered to, but that is not usually the case. Frequency of communication is also, in fact, I think this is the last of the 7 key elements. We've been over 7 yet. So this will be important for you to consider in any communication protocol, but a really prime example of this is with marketing. Lots of great research has gone into the frequency of communication in marketing messages and about what works and what doesn't work. And that will be different for each individual industry and market, etc. So a business may want to bombard their prospects with hourly and daily messages to keep themselves top of mind to their audience, but chances are that is not going to work well for the needs of your audience. And by the end of the day, you could expect that organization may not even have an audience if they went about that sort of frequency with their communication. Again, frequency is important for fulfilling organizational goals and keeping the attention of your audience, whether staff, customers, suppliers, or prospects, but the need of your audience must be maybe quite different. Ensuring there is a good match or alignment between your organization's business goals and your audience is another consideration when it comes to frequency. So often, if an organization is, and what they are delivering is well matched to their audience, well, then the frequency is easier to handle and determine as well. So let's have a look at a breakdown of organizational requirements. There is more to organizational requirements than the information needs and your organization goals. So here's an overview. Basically, you've got goals, objectives, policies and procedures, reputation, and culture as the major things that you're wanting to consider for the organization. Organizational reputation, of course, will be heavily affected not only by your conduct, but communication, and communication really is part of conduct. Likewise, with organizational culture, you want to make sure that your communication protocols are upholding culture. Now, there's different ways we can, or different kinds of internal communication that take place. There's 4 different categories that are covered in your learning materials. No doubt there are more, but for the purpose of your understanding and your competency and the tasks to complete, what you're provided with here is an explanation of standard communication, strategic communication, risk-based communication, and emergency communication. So first of all, and this is for internal communication protocols that you'll encounter these different four categories. So your communication protocols are always going to have an internal or external scope. And within the internal scope, you have these 4 categories. Strategic communication is concerned with organizational strategy. Risk-based communication involves informing workers about risks. You may be involved in relevant consultations and certainly relaying information about how risks are to be managed, or risk management. Emergency communication involves informing workers about emergencies you often have no control over. So when you as a manager or business owner are designing your communication protocols, it's easy to overlook how protocols might be needed for risk and emergency situations. And there's actually legal responsibilities around this. So very important from ethical, moral, legal, and reputation perspectives. Hopefully you've got a broader concern than purely reputation. You are introduced to risk-based communication on page 33 of your learner resource. And there is a little bit of complexity to this, which is related to conveying sufficient detail to ensure your safety, but of your workers, but not overwhelming your audience. So consider the context and whether your audience requires perhaps a combination of written and oral communication delivery. You know, that may be in a manager's meeting about workplace health and safety, or whether it could be whether that risk-based communication is informing staff generally of workplace health and safety, and more interactive communication is going to help that information to land rather than information overload. Although emergencies occur unexpectedly, they can be anticipated in advance and well prepared for. And in fact, workplace health and safety legislation requires that organisations do so. So this is one communication protocol that every business must have for carrying out workplace health, safety policies and procedures. And a fire drill is one example. Consider how your emergency communication protocol will instill a sense of responsibility in all of your staff. So now we look at the different categories of external communication and external communication protocols are going to concern the external information needs and involve the flow of information that occurs between workers and external stakeholders. So there's 3 different categories covered here, which are stakeholder communication, risk-based communication, and emergency communication. So the risk-based communication that takes place for external, that's required externally, is going to be different, and the same with your emergency communication. Different only in extent of responsibility and context. So stakeholder communication is a means of regularly coordinating, collaborating, and interacting with external stakeholders. So that pretty much covers most people or entities external to your organisation or business. External risk-based communication is concerned with the risks that affect people outside the organisation. So there you have the context that is different to internal risk-based communication. And emergency communication for external communication protocols involves informing workers about emergencies you often have no control over. If you are holding an event that is outside of your organisation, where you've gathered people from the public together and there is perhaps an emergency situation, perhaps somebody in your audience has a health event or crisis, or perhaps it's actually an emergency that occurs within the premise. That is probably the best sort of example that I can give. It's depending on the nature of your organisation and the kinds of activities that you regularly conduct will depend the likelihood of an external emergency occurring. But you do need to have your external communication protocols in place if you engage in any related activities. An example here of external stakeholder communication could be with your social media and your marketing team responding to social media messages. So the frequency would be every time you receive a message. The scope is members of the marketing team who are using this protocol, and then the audience is the public. So while the scope is internal, it is an external communication protocol because the audience is external. External risk-based communication. An example is your clients in your gym who may have injured themselves or maybe need to be preempted on how to avoid injury, a risk that has actually occurred but not an emergency, then the scope is going to be clients and workers. Everybody needs to make use. You perhaps will have eyewitnesses as well, and persons responsible would be those directly involved in the incident, as well as eyewitnesses. You may need to do some written or oral reporting. The frequency would be simply whenever an incident occurs to write those reports, and your audience will be anybody that is affected by the incident. Finally, the other consideration for your communication protocols is your ability to adapt them to suit various contexts. And there's 3 different contexts that you may need to adapt your protocols to. And the first of those is your physical context. So that involves changing the way and medium of communication. For example, if you're communicating in a noisy area or a large space, you're going to need to speak more loudly, use a microphone or visual aids potentially. Or if you're communicating with a superior, you would use more formal and straightforward language than you would use in a conversation with a friend. So, you know, your social context might be quite relaxed. It might be formal. Those are the sorts of considerations. With cultural context, your ability to adapt your communication protocol could be communicating with culturally and linguistically diverse people. So, for example, you may want to consider how relaxed and open and approachable you are, your body language, and you write all of this into your communication protocol. You would describe how to simplify, but perhaps not oversimplify the language that is being used. And you would write that kind of language into your communication protocol to ensure that it is adapted to that cultural context. So that wraps up the overview of your first chapter. I encourage you to open up your workbook straight away and get to work on your communication protocol. The first activity there is a research activity. There are tutorials to support you with your workbook also. And what we've covered in this webinar today is enough to get you started, but of course, refer to your Learn resource as needed to work your way through your workbook, including understanding the definitions that have been briefly touched on today and any further detail that you may need.